Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we will continue our reading of Further Afield by Miss Reed. Miss Reed is back in her own fields and teaching again, but she's had to leave school early to see the doctor about the broken arm that started this whole book. I arrived at the hospital in good time and followed a fellow patient to the waiting room. She was on 2 sticks and attended by an anxious daughter. The path led by a devious route to the back portions of the building and was composed of so much broken asphalt, potholes, manhole covers, and the like, that it was a wonder that anyone arrived at the waiting room without injury. I reflected on this as I picked my way cautiously between the laurel shrubs. There were quite a few of us hurt and maimed distributed on the benches, legs in plaster casts, arms supported at shoulder level, people with slings, people with bandages. It might well have been the aftermath of just such a battle scene as those being created at Fairacre School. I sat in the middle of an empty bench, but was joined within 2 minutes by a mountainous woman with a bandaged leg who told me in hideous detail what was concealed beneath her wrappings. I learned more about the vascular system of the human frame in that unfortunate 10-minute encounter than I wished to know, and it was a relief to hear my name called and to be ushered into the doctor's presence. He seemed a morose young man, and he had my sympathy. "How's it going, Mrs. Potter?" he asked. I said I was Miss Reed, and he put down the photographs he was studying rather hastily and fished out another envelope. "Of course, Mrs. Reed." "I'm single," I said. He appeared not to hear, and I remained Mrs. Reed throughout the interview. He felt my elbow and then directed me to put my arm into various positions. The results seemed to depress him. "Yes, well, you shouldn't be able to do that with your injury. It pains you, I expect, Mrs. Reed?" "Not at all." He looked disbelieving and took a firm grip on the upper arm with one hand and the lower with the other hand and tried a wrenching movement. I yelped. An expression of satisfaction spread over his dour countenance. "Still needs some improvement," he said smugly. "Keep on with the exercises. No need to come again, Mrs. Reed." He shook my hand warmly. No doubt about it, I had made his day. The mountainous woman was on her way in as I came out. "Coming again?" she asked. "No," I said triumphantly, and made my escape into the sunshine. Chapter 17. A Visit from Miss Clare. One blue and white October day, I went to Beech Green to fetch Miss Clare, who was going to pay a visit to Fairacre School, where she had taught the infants for so many years. Miss Clare, now a very old lady, lived alone in a thatched cottage which had been her home since early childhood. She was always invited to school functions and was greeted with much affection by many of the Fairacre parents who owed their own early education to her efforts. But today's visit was somewhat different. I had long been aware of the avid interest shown by the older children in the accounts of life in their village as remembered by their grandparents and other folk of that generation. Mr. Willett's memories frequently enliven our schoolroom, and naturally these first-hand accounts of local history have far more impact on the children than something read in a book. Miss Clare, who had been a pupil as well as a teacher at our school, was willing to come and talk to the children, and as soon as school dinner was cleared away, I drove to Beech Green to collect her. As always, she looked immaculate. She wore a navy blue suit and a very pale blue jumper under it. I admired the color which matched her eyes. "Dear Emily knitted it a few months before she died," she said calmly, speaking of her lifelong friend who had shared her cottage for the last few years. "I keep it for best. I should like it to last." She was carrying a basket covered with a white cloth which she insisted on holding herself. She nursed it carefully through the journey, and I wondered what it contained. She was as long-sighted as ever, and on our drive back she pointed out a hovering sparrowhawk, which I confess I should have missed completely, and a weasel which emerged from the grass verge for an instant before turning tail and scurrying back to cover. Her mind was as keen as her eyesight, and she regaled me with snippets of beach green gossip and with future plans for her garden and a description of some new curtains she was sewing for her bedroom, until I began to feel lazier and more inefficient than ever. She was greeted with enthusiasm by my class when we entered. Genuine affection, I knew, inspired 9/10 of their exuberance, but I was aware of the fact that they would not need to exert themselves in work of their own that afternoon, and this partly contributed to their jubilation. We set the most comfortable chair close to the front row, and the children at the back of the classroom came forward to squeeze companionably 3 in a desk so that every word of Miss Clare's should be heard. I sat at my desk and watched their intent faces. Certainly Miss Clare had lost none of her old magic in holding children's interest. The contents of the basket emerged one by one. The first object to be held up was a small china mug with a picture of Queen Victoria on the side. "We all had one of these given to us," she told the children, "when the good Queen had reigned for 60 years. It was called her Diamond Jubilee, and you can see it written here." "Were you in this school then?" asked Linda Moffat. "No, my dear, I was at Beach Green School then." She went on to describe the junketings of that far distant day when she was a young child, joining with her sister Ada in the sports arranged in a nearby field. She told them how she came to Fairacre School a year or two later, carefully omitting the reason, which I knew, for the move. A weak headmaster with views too advanced for his time had caused so much concern among the parents that several of them had transferred their children to other local schools, despite the long walks in every kind of weather which this involved. Miss Clare described those daily walks. It was almost 3 miles from her cottage to the school, and she told the wondering class where she found a robin's nest one spring, and where a tiny river once overflowed one February, and she and Emily Davis, her friend, took off their boots and stockings to paddle through the flood to get to school. She showed them more treasures from her basket. A starched white pinafore, kept for Sundays, intrigued the girls, who admired the insertion down the front as it was passed round the class for them to examine. Her first copybook from Beach Green School, with rows and rows of pothooks and hangers on the first few pages, and maxims of a strong moral flavor on the rest, was a source of wonder. But the object which gave them most excitement was the photograph of the whole Fairacre School taken outside in our playground with Mr. Wardle, the then headmaster, his wife, the infants teacher, Miss Taylor, and Dolly herself and Emily Davis as pupil teachers, standing meekly at one side of the rows of children. The clothes of the latter caused hilarity and a certain amount of sympathy. "What's he do with that great old thing round his neck?" asked Patrick, gazing with bewilderment at one boy sporting an Eton collar. And the fact that nearly all the children wore lace-up boots, despite the brilliant sunshine which had caused most of them to screw up their eyes against the dazzle, puzzled my class considerably. She described the village as she remembered it so long ago, telling of houses and barns now vanished, of splendid trees which had towered over the roofs felled years before, of a disused chapel now turned into a house, and a host of other changes in their environment. The questions came thick and fast, and she answered all with care and composure. The last thing to be brought from the basket for the children's delectation was a fine Bible. "I was lucky enough to win the bishop's Bible," she told them. "I sat just there where Ernest is sitting, and it rained so hard we could hardly hear the questions, I remember." The bishop's Bible is still presented annually to the child who seems best grounded in religious knowledge, so that many a child in the class has just such a Bible at home, presented to a parent or relative years before. It seemed to bring home to them the continuity of tradition in this old school, and the bond between the Victorian child and those of the present day was forged even more firmly in Miss Clare's last few minutes with the class. Patrick, primed and rehearsed beforehand, thanked her beautifully, and the children were sent to play. I feared that she might be tired by her efforts, but she seemed stimulated, and insisted on calling on the infants after play where she spent the rest of the school afternoon. "Do you reckon," said Ernest, "that you'll live as long as Miss Clare?" I said I doubted it. "Why not?" chorused the class. "Children nowadays," I told them with as much solemnity as I could muster, "are not as well behaved as those Miss Clare taught. Teachers get worn out before their time." They smiled indulgently at me and at one another. I would have my little joke. Miss Clare came over to the schoolhouse for tea when school was over. One last object not shown to the children was produced. It was a pot of her own plum jam, which made a most welcome addition to my larder. The fire crackled merrily, for I had slipped across during playtime to put a match to it. Outside, the shadows were already beginning to lengthen, and the chill of autumn became apparent as evening fell. "It's a time of year I love," said Miss Clare, stirring her tea. "I love to see the barns full of straw bales, and to know the grain is safely stored, and to watch them plowing 100-acre field ready for another crop. I always feel when the harvest's home that that's the true end of one year and the beginning of the next." "I must admit," I agreed, "that there's something very satisfying in putting up all the tatty annuals and having a gorgeous bonfire in the garden. I'd like to think it's simply an appreciation of good husbandry, but I know that it's partly the thought of being relieved of gardening for a few months. And it's a positive pleasure to see the lawnmower go for its annual overhaul at the end of the summer. The older I get, the less I enjoy pushing a mower. Mr. Willett does it quite often, but he has so much to do in the village I don't rely on him." Miss Clare sighed. "A man is useful. I suppose if we're honest, we miss having husbands." "Like most things, there are points for and against husbands," I told her about Mrs. Coggs. "I hope she's an exception, poor woman. It isn't only as a husband that Arthur Coggs fails. He's a complete failure at everything else. He won't work, he drinks, he lies, and he sponges on the rest of us. But after all, he's not typical of most men, and personally, I very much regret that I did not marry." "You surprise me. I've always thought of you as one of the happiest, most serene people I know, with a perfectly full and satisfying life." Miss Clare smiled. "I am happy, and of course one fills one's life whether single or married. I don't say that I sit and mope about being a spinster. I'm much too aware of my good fortune in having a home of my own, in a place I love, among a host of friends. But it's natural, I think, to wish to have someone of the next generation to carry on one's tradition and work. No, I think if I had been able to marry Arnold, I should truly have been happier still." She fingered the gold locket, which she always wears, containing the photograph of her fiancé so tragically killed in the First World War. "After Arnold, there was nobody whom I could care for enough to marry. In any case, there was a dearth of young men after those terrible 4 years of war, and here in Fairacre and Bush Green, of course, men were few and far between, and we hardly ever went further afield than Caxley to meet others." Which was true. When one came to think of it, those couples of Miss Clare's generation were probably born and brought up within a very few miles of each other. More probably still, they were related, which accounted for the few names in those old registers shared by a large number of children. "No cars, no holidays abroad," I said, thinking aloud. "It certainly restricted one's choice. Not only that, there were so few openings for girls and boys. I could either go into domestic service, or a shop, or nursing, or teaching. Really, there was nothing else open to a girl from a poor home. Nowadays, the young things go all over the world, or get a grant for further education somewhere miles from their own area, where they meet scores of other people from all walks of life. No wonder they seem so sophisticated compared with ourselves at that age." "But are they happier?" "When it comes to marriage, I have my doubts. In our day, we took our marriage vows pretty seriously, and divorce was difficult and expensive. You knew you must make a go of the affair. Maybe there was a lot of unhappiness which was kept hidden, But on the whole, I think the young people did better when they waited for each other and got to know themselves more thoroughly. Tibby arrived on the windowsill, mouthing his complaints. I hurried to let him in. His fur was fresh and cold, smelling of dry grass, bruised leaves, and all outdoors. "You would make a very good wife yourself," said Miss Clare, watching me pour some milk into a saucer for my domestic tyrant. "The chance would be a fine thing," I replied. "No, I haven't the pluck to risk it, even if I did have the chance. The single state suits me very well." "Tell me more about Crete," said Miss Clare. And in that moment I knew that Amy's troubles were known to her and, no doubt, to most other people in the neighborhood. Nothing had been said, and certainly not by me, but here it was again, that extraordinary awareness by country people of what is going on about them. I launched enthusiastically into an account of all the wonders I had seen, and out came the photographs and maps and guidebooks. It was past 7 o'clock when I finally drove her home, and never once was Amy's name spoken between us. Nevertheless, I knew Amy's affairs were now common knowledge, and I was not surprised. Mrs. Pringle's return to her duties I greeted with mingled relief and apprehension. We had done our best in the last few weeks to keep things clean and tidy, but I doubted if our standards would please Mrs. Pringle. I did not doubt for long. "Here," said the lady, issuing from the back lobby where the washing up is done. "What's become of my mop? Alice Willett thrown it out?" I said I did not know. "Hardly worn, that mop. Favorite of mine. I hope nothing's come of it." I thought of the character in Cold Comfort Farm who had the same affection for his little twig mop. "Perhaps it's been put somewhere else," I suggested weakly. "Everything, as far as I can see," boomed Mrs. Pringle, "has been put somewhere different. And the bar soap's almost gone, and them matches is standing for all to see and help themselves to." This was a side swipe at Mr. Willett, luckily not present, or battle would have been joined without hesitation. "And where's the little slatted mat I stands on at the sink?" demanded the lady. "I think it got broken." "Then the office should send out another. If I have to stand on damp concrete in my state of health, I'll be back in Caxley Hospital before you can say knife." I said I would indent for another mat without delay. Mrs. Pringle prowled around my classroom, sniffing suspiciously. "Funny smell this place has got. You been letting the mice in?" "Is it likely?" I responded coldly. "Do you imagine I spread a mouse banquet of cheese crumbs and bacon rinds and then open the door and invite them in?" "There's no saying," was Mrs. Pringle's rejoinder. She ran a fat finger along the top of the door and surveyed the resulting grime. "Not much dusting done, neither," she commented. "The children can't reach the tops of the doors." "There's others who can," she answered. As usual, I could see that I should lose this battle. Luckily, at this juncture, the new boy Derek appeared on the scene with a cut finger, and I was obliged to break off our exchanges and attend to him. As I wrapped up his finger, I noticed his eyes were fixed on Mrs. Pringle, who still roamed the room, sniffing and making small noises of disapproval as she examined cupboard tops, window sills, and even the inside of the piano. "Off you go," I said when I had completed my first aid. "Try to keep it clean." Mrs. Pringle made her way into the infant's room. No doubt she would find plenty there to gloat over, I thought. Through the open window, I became conscious of two new voices. One belonged to Derek. "Who's that lady in there?" "Ma Pringle." "What does she do? Is she a teacher?" "Nah, old Ma Pringle, she's the one what keeps the school clean." "But I thought we did that." "You thought wrong then, mate. We done a bit while she was ill, but I bet Ma Pringle don't reckon we kept it clean." Too true, I thought, too true. Chapter 18. Autumn Pleasures. Sunday mornings are busy times for school teachers. It is then that they usually tackle the week's washing, any outstanding household jobs, and, of course, the weekend shopping. The latter can usually be done in Fairacre, but this Saturday in question I found that I needed such haberdashery items as elastic and pearl buttons. And there were one or two garments to be collected from the cleaners as well. I faced the fact that I must get out the car and make a sortie into Caxley. While I was choosing a piece of rock salmon for Tibby and 2 fillet of plaice for myself, Amy smote me on the back. As usual, she was looking as if she had come out of a bandbox, elegant in dark green with shoes to match. I became conscious of my shabby camel car coat, heavily marked down the right sleeve with black oil from the lock of the car door, and my scuffed car shoes. "Nearly finished?" she asked. "Just about. A pound of sprouts and I'm done." "Let's have a spot of lunch together at the Bull," suggested Amy. "They do some very good toasted sandwiches in the bar, and I'm famished." "So am I. An hour's shopping in Caxley finishes me. Partly, I think, it's the smug pleasure with which half the assistants tell you they haven't got what you want. And that it's no good ordering it," Amy added. "I know. I've been suffering that way myself this morning." I bought my sprouts and we entered the Bull. A bright fire was welcoming, and we sank gratefully into the leather armchairs to drink our sherry. We were the only people in the bar at that moment, for we were early. Within a short time, the place would be crowded. "Vanessa's back at work," said Amy. "Did Gerard take her to Scotland?" "Oh, no, he's back in London in his little flat, putting the final touches to the book, I gather. A very personable young man picked her up. I never did catch his name. Could it have been Torquil?" "Sounds likely. I take it he was a Scot?" "They're all Scots at the moment, which makes me anxious about Gerard. He really should be a little more alert if he wants to capture Vanessa." "Perhaps he doesn't." Amy's mouth took on a determined line. "I'm quite sure she is fond of him. She talks of him such a lot and always is asking his advice. You know, she really respects Gerard. Such a good basis for marriage where there is a difference in age." "Well, there's nothing you can do about it," I pointed out. "Have another sherry?" I went to get our glasses refilled. Amy was looking thoughtful as I replaced them on the table by the sandwiches. "James was down during the week," she said. "He looks worried to death. I don't know whether the girl is wavering and he is having to increase his efforts, or whether he senses that I'm wavering, but something's going to give before long, and I have a horrible feeling it's going to be me. It's an impossible situation for us. What's more, I keep getting tactful expressions of sympathy from people in the village, and I'm not sure that that isn't harder to bear than James' indiscretions." I remembered Miss Clare. "You can't keep any secrets in a village," I said. "You know that anyway. Don't let that add to your worries." "But how do people find out? I've not said a word to a soul. Even Mrs. Bennet, our daily, knows nothing." "You'd be surprised. A lot of it's guesswork, plus putting 2 and 2 together and making 5. Bush telegraph is one of the strongest factors in village life and works for good as well as ill. Look how people rallied when I broke my arm." "Which reminds me," said Amy, looking at her watch, "I must get back to pack up the laundry. Mrs. Bennet has been for the last 2 days. She's down with this wretched measles. Caught it from her grandchild. There's a lot about. 3 more cases last week in the infants' room. There's talk of closing Bent School," Amy told me. "Actually, they rang up last week to see if I could do some supply work there. But I felt I just couldn't with James coming down and so much hanging over me. They're 2 staff short and no children." "There's talk of closing Bent School," Amy told me. "Actually, they rang up last week to see if I could do some supply work there, but I felt I just couldn't with James coming down and so much hanging over me. There are 2 staff short and no end of children away." "Have you had it?" "What, measles?" "Yes, luckily at the age of 6 or 7, and all I can remember is a bowl of oranges permanently by the bedside and the counterpane covered with copies of Rainbow and Tiger Tim's Annual." We collected our shopping and made for the door, much fortified by the Bull's hospitality. "I wonder if I've got the stamina to go looking for a new winter coat," I mused aloud. Amy eyed my dirty sleeve. "You certainly look as though you need one," she commented. "The thing is, should it be navy blue or brown? In a weak moment last year, I bought a navy blue skirt and shoes, and I ought to make up my mind if I'm to continue with navy blue, which means a new handbag as well, or play safe with something brown, which will go with everything else." Amy shook her head sadly. "Well, I can't spare the time to come with you, I'm afraid. What problems you set yourself, and you know why?" I shook my head in return. "No method," said Amy severely, waving goodbye. She's right, I thought, watching her trim figure vanishing down the street. I decided that I could not face a problem at this moment, collected my car, and drove thankfully along the road to Fairacre. And we will continue with the pleasures of autumn next time.